The letter fell from the Duke's hand, and Serafina saw it land near the fireplace, half burned at one corner where he had almost thrown it into the flames before changing his mind. She had been standing outside the study door for only a moment, but that was enough to hear her own name spoken in a tone she did not like, a tone that meant decisions were being made about her life without her in the room. She cannot go on like this, alone in that house with no one but the maids, her father was saying to someone Serafina could not see. I have written to my sister. If nothing changes by spring, Serafina will go to live with her in the north. Serafina pushed the door open before she could stop herself. Her father, Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, looked up sharply from behind his desk. The man across from him, his steward, rose at once and bowed his way out of the room, leaving father and daughter alone with the fire crackling between them. You would send me away, Serafina said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, had curled into fists. Without asking me, without a single word. I am asking now, the Duke said, though they both knew that was not true. Serafina, you spend your days wandering the gardens and your evenings in silence. You have had 3 governesses in 4 years, and each one left saying the same thing, that you would not be taught, that you would not be reached. I am your father. I worry. You are not worried, Serafina said. You are tired of me. It is easier to send me to Aunt Margaret than to sit with me at dinner and ask how I am. The words landed harder than she meant them to, and for a moment something moved across her father's face, something that looked almost like grief. He was a man who had buried a wife too young and raised a daughter alone in a house too large for the both of them, and Serafina knew, somewhere beneath her anger, that he did not know how to do either of those things well. But knowing that did not soften the fear rising in her chest, the fear of being packed into a carriage and sent to a stranger's house in a county she had never seen. There is one more governess, the Duke said carefully, as though testing whether the words would calm her or make things worse. A Miss Hartley. She comes with excellent references from a family in Bath. If she can do what the others could not, then there will be no talk of the North. That is my promise to you. Serafina wanted to laugh. Another governess. Another young woman who would arrive full of confidence and leave within the season, defeated by a girl who had long ago decided that lessons and lectures were a poor substitute for the mother she had lost, and the father who had retreated into his ledgers and his letters rather than face an empty house. She did not say any of this. She only turned and walked out of the study, her skirts sweeping over the polished floor, and did not look back to see whether her father watched her go. That night Serafina sat by her window and looked out over the grounds of Ashworth Hall, the hedges cut into careful shapes, the fountain silent for the winter, the long gravel drive disappearing into the dark toward the road that led, eventually, to everywhere else in the world. She was 20 years old, and she had never once left the county on her own, never chosen her own company, never had a single day that was entirely hers to shape. Somewhere out there was a woman named Miss Hartley, packing a trunk, perhaps saying goodbye to a family of her own, coming to a house she had never seen to try, like all the others, to fix a girl who did not think she needed fixing. Serafina decided, before she had even met her, that she would not like Miss Hartley. The carriage arrived 4 days later, in the gray hour just after breakfast when the sky had not yet decided whether it would rain. Serafina watched from the upstairs window as the door opened, and a young woman stepped down onto the gravel, steadying her hat against the wind with one gloved hand. She was not what Serafina had expected. The last governess had been stern and gray-haired, and the one before that had worn her disapproval like a second coat. This woman looked younger than either, though not so young that she could be mistaken for a student herself, and she stood for a moment simply looking up at the house, at its gray stone and its tall windows, with an expression that was not fear and was not awe but something quieter, something like curiosity. Serafina told herself she would not go down to greet her. She sat instead at her writing desk with a book open in front of her, though she did not read a single word of it, and listened to the sounds of the house below, the front door, the housekeeper's voice, footsteps on the stairs. When the knock came at her own door, she did not answer at first. Lady Serafina. It was Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, her voice carrying the particular patience of a woman who had worked in this house since before Serafina was born. "Miss Hartley has arrived. Your father asks that you come down and meet her." "Tell my father I have a headache," Serafina said. There was a pause, and then, to Serafina's surprise, it was not Mrs. Doyle who answered. "I could come up instead if that would be easier," said a voice she did not recognize, calm and unhurried, with no trace of impatience in it at all. "There is no rule that says a first meeting must happen in a parlor." Serafina sat very still. She had expected the new governess to insist, to appeal to duty and propriety the way the others always had, and she had prepared several answers for exactly that argument. She had not prepared for this, for a stranger simply offering her a choice. She rose, smoothed her skirts, and opened the door. Miss Hartley stood in the hallway with Mrs. Doyle a step behind her, still wearing her traveling coat, a small case in one hand as though she had come straight up the stairs without stopping to settle in. She was, Serafina thought, quite ordinary to look at, brown hair pinned simply, a plain green dress with no lace or ornament, and yet there was something steady in the way she held herself, something that did not match the nervous, eager expression Serafina remembered from the other governesses on their first day. "I am told you have a headache," Miss Hartley said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I find that headaches announced before a visitor has even entered the room are rarely about the head at all." Serafina felt her face grow warm, caught somewhere between anger and, unwillingly, amusement. "You are very forward for someone who has been in this house for a quarter of an hour." "I am told I have a habit of it," Miss Hartley said. "My name is Eleanor Hartley. I understand you did not ask for me, and I will not pretend that I expect you to be glad I am here. But I would like, if you will permit it, to at least begin without pretending otherwise." It was such an odd thing to say, so unlike the careful, hopeful speeches the other governesses had given about looking forward to their studies together, that Serafina found she did not have a ready answer for it. Mrs. Doyle, sensing perhaps that her presence was no longer required, excused herself and went back down the stairs, leaving the two of them alone in the hallway with the gray afternoon light falling through the window at its end. "My father sent for you because he wants to send me to my aunt in the north if you fail," Serafina said, because it seemed pointless to hide it, and because some part of her wanted to see how Miss Hartley would respond to being told, on her very first day, that she was already being measured for failure. "The others left within a season. I expect you will too." Miss Hartley considered this for a moment, unhurried, as though the words did not sting the way Serafina had half hoped they would. "Perhaps I will," she said. "I cannot promise you otherwise, not yet, not on a first afternoon when we do not know each other at all. But I will say this. I did not come here to fix you, Lady Serafina. I was told you needed lessons in French and history and drawing, and I intend to teach you those things if you will let me. What I will not do is treat you as a problem to be solved. I have met enough people who were treated that way to know how little good it does." Something in Serafina's chest, some old and guarded thing she had not examined closely in years, shifted very slightly at those words, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. She had been called clever and difficult, and closed off, and once memorably a disappointment, by governesses who thought they were speaking kindly. She had never once been told that she was not a problem. "We shall see, Miss Hartley," she said, and it was not quite a welcome, but it was not quite a dismissal either. "We shall," Eleanor agreed, and this time the almost smile became a real one, brief and quiet, there and then gone. "I will see you at supper, my lady. I understand your father keeps early hours." She turned and made her way back down the corridor toward the rooms that had been prepared for her, and Serafina stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the fading sound of footsteps, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a small and unfamiliar flicker of curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. Downstairs in his study, the Duke watched from his window as the carriage that had brought Miss Hartley pulled away down the long drive, empty now, on its way back to the village. He did not know, as he turned back to his papers and his ledgers and the quiet, ordered business of running an estate, that he had just set in motion something far larger than a simple arrangement of lessons and lectures. He thought only that he had found, perhaps, a governess who might last longer than a season, and that his daughter, for once, had not shouted or wept or locked herself in her room. It was, he told himself, a promising beginning. He had no way of knowing how right and how wrong he was. Supper that first evening was a quiet affair, the three of them seated at a table built for 20, the Duke at its head, Serafina at his right hand, and a leaner placed, at the Duke's insistence, close enough to join the conversation rather than eat in silence at the far end, as the previous governesses had often done. Serafina watched her father across the candlelight, waiting for the usual questions about the journey and the weather to run their course, and was surprised when he asked Alina, with something like real interest, what she thought of the library. "I have not yet seen it, Your Grace," Alina said, "though I am told it is the finest in the county." "It was my wife's favorite room," the Duke said, and something in his voice softened in a way Serafina rarely heard. "She read to Serafina there when Serafina was very small. I have not had the heart to change it since." Serafina set down her fork. She did not like to be reminded, at the table in front of a stranger, of a mother she barely remembered except as a warmth and a voice, and the smell of lavender that still, somehow, clung faintly to the cushions in that room. She expected Alina to say something comforting and useless, the way people always did when death was mentioned at a meal, some soft phrase meant to close the subject as quickly as it had been opened. Instead, Alina turned to her. "Perhaps you might show it to me tomorrow, Lady Serafina. I find I learn a room better from someone who has grown up in it than from any housekeeper's tour." It was such a small thing, and yet Serafina felt it land somewhere unexpected, a request that was not really about the library at all but about her, about what she remembered and what she might be willing to share. She said yes before she had quite decided to, and the Duke, watching the exchange, allowed himself the smallest of relieved smiles, the first in a long while. The days that followed fell into a shape Serafina had not expected to accept so easily. In the mornings there was French, which she had always found tedious with her other governesses, drilled through with lists of verbs and endless correction, but which Alina taught instead through stories, through the letters of long-dead poets and the diaries of women who had lived lives far stranger and freer than anything Serafina had imagined for herself. In the afternoons there was drawing, out in the gardens when the weather allowed it, Alina setting up 2 stools beneath the old oak near the fountain and sketching, alongside her, rather than simply instructing from a distance. "You draw the hedges as though they are afraid of you," Alina said one afternoon, leaning over to look at Serafina's page, where the neat rows of clipped yew had come out stiff and joyless, all straight lines and hard corners. "They are hedges," Serafina said. "They do not have feelings to be afraid with." "No," Alina agreed, "but you drew them as you see them, and I think you see a great many things in this garden as things to be endured rather than enjoyed." She took up her own pencil, and with a few quick strokes softened the same hedges into something almost alive, catching a gust of wind Serafina had not thought to notice, a bird startled mid-flight from one of the branches. "Try again. Not what is there. What it feels like to be there." Serafina tried, and the second drawing was better, looser, and she found herself surprised by how much satisfaction there was in it, a small private pride she had not felt over her own work in years. She looked up to find Alina watching her, not the page but her face, with an expression Serafina could not quite name, something warm and careful at once, and she felt her cheeks color for no reason she could explain and looked quickly back down at her drawing. It was history, though, where the two of them found their truest common ground. Alina did not simply recite the names of kings and the dates of battles. She spoke of the women who were left out of the history books entirely, the ones who had run estates alone while their husbands were at war, the ones who had written under false names because no publisher would take a woman's work under her own, the ones who had loved quietly, in the margins of their diaries, people the world would never have allowed them to love openly. Serafina found herself leaning forward across the desk during these lessons, asking question after question, staying long after the appointed hour had ended, until Alina would finally laugh and say that even the most fascinating woman in history deserved her supper, and that Serafina's would grow cold if she did not go down. "You are different from the others," Serafina said one such evening, as they walked together back toward the main part of the house, the corridor lit by candles that threw long shadows against the old paneled walls. "The other governesses wanted me to memorize things. You want me to think about them." "Memorizing is easy," Alina said. "Anyone can be taught to repeat a fact. It is much harder and much more useful to teach someone to ask why the fact is true, and who benefited from it being remembered that way, and who was left out." She glanced sideways at Serafina, and there was something almost shy in the look, unusual for a woman who otherwise carried herself with such quiet certainty. "Besides, I did not want to be another person in this house who treated you as though you had nothing worth saying. I suspect you have had enough of that already." Serafina did not answer at once. They had reached the top of the main staircase, where the corridor opened into the wide gallery hung with portraits of Ashworth ancestors going back 3 centuries, stern men and silent women staring down from their frames as if judging every conversation that passed beneath them. She thought of all the years since her mother had died, the parade of tutors and governesses who had come and gone, each one leaving with some version of the same complaint, that Lady Serafina was clever but closed, sharp-tongued but unreachable, a girl who kept the whole world at the length of her own 2 arms. "I did not think anyone had noticed that," she said finally, quietly, more honestly than she had meant to be. "I noticed it within an hour of meeting you," Alina said. "It was in the way you tried to send me away before you had even seen my face. People who feel safe do not need to do that. People who have been disappointed too many times do." The words settled over Serafina like a hand laid gently on her shoulder, and for a moment she could not speak at all. No one in this house, not the servants who had known her since infancy, not her own father, had ever named the thing so plainly, so kindly, without either pity or judgment attached to it. She looked at Alina in the candlelight and felt something shift inside her chest, some door that had been shut for years easing open by the smallest, most careful degree. "Thank you," she said at last, "for not treating me as a problem." "I told you I would not," Alina said, and smiled, and this time the smile lasted longer than the one before it, longer than any smile Serafina could remember receiving from anyone since her mother had died. Winter deepened around Ashworth Hall in the weeks that followed, the gardens losing their color, the fountain freezing at its edges, the long evenings drawing in early enough that lessons often continued by candlelight. The 2 of them bent over books at the desk in the small sitting room that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, their own particular corner of the house. Serafina found herself waking each morning with something she had not felt in years, an eagerness, small but real, to begin the day rather than endure it. She found herself watching for Alina's step in the corridor, listening for her voice at the breakfast table, saving up small observations through the quiet hours to share with her later, the way one might save coins in a jar, a private and growing collection meant for a single particular purpose. She told herself at first that this was simply what it felt like to have a friend, since she had never truly had one, not a governess who did not report every private thought back to her father, not a companion of her own choosing rather than one selected for her by duty and circumstance. But there were moments that did not fit neatly into the shape of friendship, moments Serafina turned over privately at night when the house had gone silent, and she lay awake listening to the wind against her window. The way her breath caught, just slightly, when Alina reached across the desk to correct her grip on a pencil, their fingers brushing for the briefest instant. The way she found herself memorizing the particular cadence of Alina's laugh, low and unhurried, so different from the polite, empty laughter she heard from the few young ladies of the neighboring estates who occasionally called at the house. The way an entire ordinary afternoon could feel transformed simply because Alina was somewhere within its hours. She did not have a name yet for what was growing in her, not fully, not in words she was ready to say even to herself. But she felt it all the same, quiet and persistent, like a seed pushing up through frozen ground before the first sign of spring. The Duke, for his part, was pleased beyond what he let show. He watched his daughter at supper laughing at something Alina had said, watched her carry a book of poetry down to breakfast that she had clearly been reading late into the night, watched the hard, guarded set of her shoulders soften by degrees week after week. And he told himself that he had made the right choice after all, that Miss Hartley was proving to be exactly the sort of steady, sensible influence his daughter had needed for years. He wrote to his sister in the north and told her that the arrangements they had discussed would not, after all, be necessary. He did not think, even for a moment, to ask himself what precisely it was that had brought about such a change, or to wonder whether the warmth he saw blooming in his daughter's face was gratitude for good teaching, or something else entirely, something he was not yet prepared to see. It was Mrs. Doyle, in the end, who noticed first, though she said nothing to anyone, not then. She had run this house long enough to know the particular quality of a young woman's silence when she was thinking of someone, the particular brightness that came into a face at the sound of a certain footstep in the hall, and she had seen, more than once now, Lady Seraphina standing at the window of the small sitting room in the last light of the afternoon, watching for Miss Hartley's return from an errand in the village, with an expression the old housekeeper recognized, uneasily, from her own girlhood. Decades before, in a life she rarely allowed herself to remember. She said nothing, but she watched, and she waited, and she began, quietly, to wonder how long it would be before the two young women at the center of the house came to understand, each in her own time, what everyone around them but themselves had already begun to see. Spring came to Ashworth Hall slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, the frost lifting first from the low meadows and only later from the shaded corners of the formal garden, where the old stone walls kept the sun away longest. Seraphina had lived through 19 such springs before this one, and she could not remember a single one of them arriving with the strange, quickened feeling that this one brought, as though the whole world were waking up alongside something inside her that had been asleep far longer than a season. She and Alina had taken to walking the grounds together in the late afternoons, once the day's lessons were finished, a habit that had begun as an extension of their drawing exercises and had slowly become something else, something neither of them named but both of them protected, guarding the hour as carefully as if it were written into the household's formal schedule. They walked past the fountain, now running again, past the kitchen garden where the first shoots of green were pushing up through the dark soil, out toward the low stone wall that marked the edge of the formal grounds, and looked out over the wilder land beyond, fields and hedgerows rolling away toward a line of distant trees. "Do you ever wish to see it?" Seraphina asked one such afternoon, nodding toward the horizon. "Beyond the wall, I mean, all of it, not just the county but everywhere." "I have seen more of it than most," Alina said. "Bath before this. Before that, a house near the coast, and before that my own family's home, which was smaller than your father's stables." She said this without bitterness, simply as fact, the way she said most things, plainly and without apology. "But yes, there is more of the world I would like to see. I do not think that wish ever fully leaves a person, no matter how much of it they have already seen." "I have seen almost none of it," Seraphina admitted. "My father says a woman of my position does not need to travel, that everything worth having comes to her eventually, in its own time, if she is patient." She pulled her shawl tighter against the wind. "I do not think I believe him. I think some things do not come unless you go and find them yourself." Alina was quiet for a moment, watching the same distant tree line Seraphina had been watching. "That is a dangerous thing to believe in a house like this," she said finally, and though her tone was light, there was something careful beneath it, something that made Seraphina glance at her sharply. "Dangerous how?" "Because wanting things you are not meant to want is always dangerous for people in our position," Alina said. "Different positions, I know, yours and mine, but neither of us was raised to simply reach out and take what we want, were we? You are meant to wait for a husband your father approves of. I am meant to be grateful for a position in a good household and ask for nothing more than my wages and my keep." She smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. "We are both, in our own ways, taught to want small things and call it contentment." Serafina turned this over in her mind as they walked back toward the house in the fading light, the words settling into her the way certain sentences did, staying long after they had been spoken, returning to her at odd hours, in the middle of a different lesson, in the quiet moments before sleep. She thought of all the things she had never let herself want because wanting them had seemed pointless, a waste of feeling spent on something that would never be granted. A friend who did not report to her father. A conversation that was not about lessons or duty. Someone who looked at her and saw a person rather than a problem to be solved before spring. She was beginning, she realized with a kind of quiet alarm, to want a great many things she had never let herself want before. And increasingly, all of those things seemed to have the same shape, the same face, the same low and steady voice. It was an ordinary Tuesday, weeks later, when the feeling she had been carefully not naming finally forced itself into the light. They had gone that morning to the village on an errand for the Duke, a rare outing beyond the estate walls, and on the walk back, a sudden spring shower had caught them a full mile from the house, sending them running, laughing despite themselves, for the shelter of an old stone barn that stood at the edge of one of the tenant farms. They stood pressed close together just inside the wide doorway, watching the rain fall in silver sheets across the fields, both of them soaked through, Aliner's hair coming loose from its pins in dark, wet strands against her neck. "Your father will have my position for this," Aliner said, laughing, wringing out the edge of her sleeve. "Bringing his daughter home like a drowned cat." "He will forgive you," Serafina said. "He forgives you most things." "Does he?" Aliner glanced at her, still smiling, but something in her expression had shifted, become more careful. "I had not noticed." "He watches you at supper," Serafina said, "trying to decide whether to be grateful to you or suspicious of you. I think he has not yet decided which." "And you," Aliner asked, "which have you decided?" The rain kept falling outside, steady and gray, and inside the barn the light was dim and close, and Serafina became suddenly, sharply aware of how near they were standing to one another, close enough that she could see the individual drops of rain caught in Aliner's eyelashes, close enough to feel the warmth coming off her despite the damp chill of her clothes. She opened her mouth to answer lightly, to say something about gratitude, about lessons, about how much better her French had become in these months, and found that none of those words would come. "I have decided," she said instead, her voice quieter than she meant it to be, "that I do not know what I would do if you left." She had not planned to say it. The words had simply arrived, pulled out of her by the strange, suspended quality of the moment, the rain and the closeness and months of careful walks and careful conversations building towards something she had not let herself examine too closely until now. She watched Aliner's face change, saw something pass across it that was not quite surprise, as though she too had been waiting in her own careful way for a moment exactly like this one, and had not been certain it would ever come. "Serafina," Aliner said, and it was the first time she had used her name without the title in front of it, the first time in all their months together, and the sound of it, plain and unadorned, made something in Serafina's chest tighten almost painfully. "I think we should go back to the house." It was not a rejection, not quite, but it was not what Serafina had hoped for either, and she felt the warmth of the moment cool rapidly into something closer to shame. She looked away, out at the rain, and nodded, and they walked the rest of the way back to Ashworth Hall in a silence that was not comfortable, both of them soaked and cold and careful now not to walk too close together, as though the barn had taught them both a lesson about the danger of standing near one another when no one else was watching. That evening at supper Aliner was quieter than usual, answering the Duke's questions politely, but offering nothing beyond what was asked, and Serafina picked at her food and said almost nothing at all. And the Duke, absorbed in a letter that had arrived that afternoon concerning some matter of the estate, did not notice the strange, brittle quality that had settled over the table, the careful way his daughter and her governess avoided each other's eyes. Serafina lay awake long into the night, turning the afternoon over and over, replaying the words she had said, wondering if she had ruined something without fully understanding what it was she had been trying to build. She had not meant to say something so plain, so undisguised, and yet some part of her, the part that had spent months watching for Aliner's footstep in the hall and saving up small thoughts to share with her, was almost relieved to have finally spoken it aloud, even carelessly, even badly. She had not lied. She truly did not know what she would do if Aliner left, and the not knowing frightened her more than almost anything had in years. She rose before dawn the next morning, unable to sleep any further, and made her way down to the small sitting room where their lessons were held, thinking she might sit quietly with a book until the household woke. She found Aliner already there, seated at the desk by the window in the gray early light, a letter open in front of her that she folded quickly and set aside when she heard the door. "You are awake early," Aliner said, and her voice was careful, measured, the warmth of the previous months held slightly at bay, as though she had decided overnight to build a wall and was only now beginning the work of it. "I could not sleep," Serafina said. She hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure of her welcome. "Aliner, about yesterday, what I said in the barn, I did not mean to make things strange between us. I only meant that I have grown to depend on your company, more than I perhaps should, and I did not think before I spoke." It was not quite the truth, and she suspected Aliner knew it was not quite the truth, but it offered them both a door through which the previous day's honesty could be quietly set aside, filed away as an overstatement rather than a confession, and Serafina watched Aliner's shoulders ease very slightly at the offer. "There is nothing strange," Aliner said, though her eyes did not quite meet Serafina's as she said it. "You depend on your teacher. That is only natural after so many months of lessons. I am glad to have been of use to you." "Of use?" The words landed with a small, disappointing thud, so much smaller than what Serafina had wanted to hear, and yet she made herself nod, made herself accept the offered retreat, because the alternative, pressing further, asking Aliner plainly what she had truly meant by pulling away in the barn, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no way of knowing what waited below. They returned in the days that followed to something that resembled their old rhythm, French in the mornings, drawing in the gardens, history by candlelight in the evenings. But there was a new carefulness in it now, a distance held deliberately between them even when they sat close together at the same small desk, as though both of them had agreed, without ever saying so aloud, to step back from whatever ledge they had nearly walked off together in that rain-soaked barn. But Serafina noticed, in the weeks that followed, small things that told a different story than the careful distance Aliner tried to maintain. The way Aliner's hand sometimes lingered a moment too long when passing her a book. The way she would begin a sentence, something warmer, something more personal than a lesson required, and then catch herself and turn it back into something safely instructional. The way, once walking together in the garden, Aliner had reached out as though to take her hand and then, seeming to catch herself, had let her arm fall back to her side, the movement so quick Serafina might have imagined it entirely, except that she had not imagined it. She was almost certain she had not. She began to understand, slowly, painfully, that what she had said in the barn had not been unwelcome so much as frightening, that Aliner was not indifferent to her, but was instead holding herself back on purpose, for reasons Serafina did not yet fully understand but was beginning, with a kind of dawning and unwelcome clarity, to guess at. There was a whole world of reasons a governess might be afraid to want the daughter of the house who employed her, reasons that had nothing to do with her own feelings, and everything to do with the shape of the world they both lived in, its rules and its punishments for those who stepped outside them. Serafina did not know, yet, what she meant to do with that understanding. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her with its steadiness, that she was not willing to simply let the careful distance stand unchallenged, not now that she had glimpsed, however briefly, what lay beneath it. The distance Aliner had built did not stay steady for long. It was not in her nature to be cold, not truly, and within the space of a fortnight the careful formality she had tried to maintain began to crack at its edges, showing through in small, unguarded moments before she caught herself and drew the walls back up again. Serafina watched this happen again and again, a kind of quiet battle playing out across Aliner's face whenever they sat too close together over a shared book, and she began to understand that whatever Alina was fighting, she was fighting it as much for Serafina's sake as for her own. It was Alina who finally broke, though not in the way either of them might have expected. They were in the library one wet afternoon in early summer, the rain drumming steadily against the tall windows. Serafina meant to be copying out a passage of French poetry while Alina read nearby. When Serafina looked up to find Alina watching her, not reading at all, her book open and forgotten in her lap, an expression on her face so open and unguarded that Serafina's breath caught in her throat. For a moment neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, and the rain filled the silence between them until Alina seemed to catch herself, closed her book with a soft, final sound and stood. "I think I should like some air," she said, though the rain had not stopped and her voice was not quite steady. "Forgive me." She left the room quickly, without waiting for a reply, and Serafina sat alone amid the tall shelves and the gray afternoon light, her pen forgotten in her hand, the French poem abandoned halfway through its second stanza, thinking that she had never in her life seen anyone leave a room as though they were fleeing something, and understanding, with a sudden and total clarity, exactly what it was that Alina was fleeing. She did not go after her. She told herself it was patience, though it felt more like fear, the same fear that had kept her silent in the barn weeks before. Rather than pressing Alina for an answer she was not certain, she wanted to hear plainly spoken. Instead she waited, through supper that evening, where Alina ate little and spoke less, through the following days, where their lessons continued in a strained and careful politeness that fooled neither of them, and through the growing, unbearable weight of a truth that both of them now knew and neither of them had yet said aloud. It was Mrs. Doyle, in the end, who forced the matter into the light, though she did not mean to, and she would spend a long while afterward wondering whether she ought to have kept her silence a little longer. She had come upon Serafina alone in the garden one evening, sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the formal grounds, staring out at nothing in particular, and something in the girl's face, some raw and unguarded unhappiness, moved the old housekeeper to sit down beside her, an informality she would not ordinarily have allowed herself. "You have not been yourself these past weeks, my lady," Mrs. Doyle said, "nor has Miss Hartley, if I am honest." Serafina considered denying it, the way she had denied so much else these past months, but something in the quiet evening light in Mrs. Doyle's steady, unhurried presence loosened the words she had been holding so carefully closed. "I do not know what I have done," she said, "or what I have not done that I ought to have. Everything was easy between us, once. Now it is like walking on ice that I am afraid will crack beneath me." Mrs. Doyle was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the darkening garden. "I have run this house since before you were born, Lady Serafina," she said finally, "and I have seen a great many governesses come and go in that time. I have never once seen one look at her charge the way Miss Hartley looks at you when she believes no one is watching." She turned to meet Serafina's eyes, and there was no judgment in her expression, only a kind of tired, careful honesty. "And I have never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her." Serafina felt her whole body go still, caught between the relief of finally hearing the truth spoken by someone else, and the terror of what it might mean now that it existed outside her own private thoughts, spoken into the world where it could be repeated, could reach her father, could bring consequences neither she nor Alina were prepared to face. "You must say nothing," she said quickly. "Please, Mrs. Doyle, not to my father, not to anyone." "I have kept better secrets than this one in my time," Mrs. Doyle said, with a small, tired smile. "But I will tell you what I have learned in all my years in this house, for whatever it is worth to a girl who has not asked for my advice. Feelings such as these do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. They only grow quieter and angrier the longer they are made to hide." She rose, brushing off her skirts. "Whatever is between you and Miss Hartley, my lady, I think it wants a great deal more courage to face than either of you have shown it so far." She left Serafina alone with those words, and Serafina sat on the stone wall until the last light had faded entirely from the sky, thinking of courage, and of Alina's face in the library, open and unguarded and afraid, and of all the reasons a woman in Alina's position might have for choosing silence over honesty, safety over a truth that could cost her everything, her position, her reputation, her very means of supporting herself in a world that offered women like her very few paths to independence. She found Alina 2 evenings later in the small sitting room, alone, a lamp burning low on the desk, a letter in front of her that she did not fold away quickly enough this time before Serafina saw the return address, a position in a house 2 counties away, one Alina had evidently written to inquire after. "You are looking for another place," Serafina said, and her voice came out flatter than she meant it to, flat with the effort of holding back everything else that wanted to spill out alongside it. Alina did not deny it, though her hand closed slowly over the letter as though she might still hide it. "I think it would be wise," she said quietly, "for both of us." "Wise," Serafina repeated. "Is that truly the word you would choose?" "What other word would you have me use?" Alina's voice, usually so steady, had an edge of something raw in it now, something that had clearly been building for weeks behind her careful composure. "Serafina, I am the governess in your father's house. You are his only daughter, his heir in all but title. There is no version of this, of whatever this is between us, that does not end badly for one or both of us. I have seen what happens to women in my position who forget themselves. I will not become a cautionary tale told to the next girl who takes this post." "Then say it," Serafina said, taking a step closer, her heart pounding so hard she was certain Alina must be able to hear it in the quiet room. "Whatever this is. Say it plainly, just once, and then you may leave for whatever county you please, and I will not stop you. But I will not let you go without hearing it said." For a long moment Alina said nothing at all, and the lamp flickered between them, and outside the window the last birds of evening called across the darkening garden. And Serafina thought she might have finally pushed too far, might have finally driven Alina entirely behind whatever wall she had been building for weeks. But then Alina set down the letter and rose from her chair, and crossed the small distance of the room to stand directly in front of her, closer than propriety allowed, closer than anything but the truth could excuse. "I love you," Alina said quietly, plainly, the words falling into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything they touched. "I have loved you for months, longer than I have allowed myself to admit even to my own private thoughts. I have tried to make myself stop, because I know exactly how impossible it is, because I know what it would cost us both if it were ever discovered, and I have failed at every attempt. That is the truth you wish to hear, Serafina. I hope it brings you comfort rather than sorrow, though I fear it can only be the second." Serafina felt tears rise in her eyes, unexpected and immediate, relief and fear tangled together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. "It brings me both," she said. "Comfort because I have felt the same, and did not know how to say it without frightening you away entirely. And sorrow because you are right, I know you are right, that the world will not simply allow us to have this." "Then you understand why I must go," Alina said, though her voice had lost its earlier certainty, and her eyes, when they met Serafina's, were bright with the same unshed tears. "I cannot stay in this house loving you and pretending I do not. I do not have that particular strength." "And I cannot let you go," Serafina said, "having finally heard you say it. I have spent my whole life letting people leave this house, Alina. My mother in her way, every governess before you, every companion my father thought might finally reach me. I am tired of losing people to circumstance, to duty, to what is thought wise. I would rather fight for something impossible than accept another quiet, sensible loss." Alina looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, hope and fear still visibly at war, and neither of them moved to close the last small distance between them, though both of them, Serafina thought, wanted to. "Fighting for it will not be simple," Alina said at last. "Your father is a good man, but he is still a duke, bound by every expectation his title carries. What we are speaking of is not a matter he can simply choose to overlook, even if he loves you as much as I believe he does." "I know," Serafina said, "but I would rather face him honestly, and be refused than spend the rest of my life pretending I never asked at all." She did not know in that moment, standing in the lamplight with Alina close enough to touch, exactly what shape that fight would take, or how long it would be before she found the courage to bring it to her father's door. But she knew, with a certainty that steadied something long unsteady in her chest, that the letter on the desk between them would not be answered, that Alina would not leave for some distant county to become a story told carefully to the next governess who took her place, and that whatever came next, they would face it together, rather than apart. Summer settled over Ashworth Hall in full, the gardens heavy with roses, the days stretching long and golden into evening, and with it came a change in Seraphina that even the most inattentive observer in the house could not have failed to notice. She no longer waited at windows for Alina's footstep with the careful, hidden longing of the spring. She sought her out openly now, walked beside her through the gardens without troubling to keep a proper distance, laughed at things Alina said in a voice that carried further than either of them perhaps realized. She had decided, in the days following that lamplit confession in the sitting room, that she was done hiding, done pretending that the most important thing in her life was a secret to be guarded rather than a truth to be lived. Alina was more careful, still bound by an instinct for self-preservation that Seraphina, protected as she was by rank and blood, did not share and could not fully understand no matter how she tried. But even Alina's caution began to loosen, worn away by months of stolen hours and shared confidences, by the particular, irresistible ease of being fully known by another person for the first time in either of their lives. They still kept to the forms in front of the household, still addressed one another with proper titles when the servants were near, still sat at a respectable distance during lessons with the study door left open as propriety required. But anyone who watched closely, and in a great house full of servants with little to occupy their idle hours but observation, there were always those who watched closely, would have seen the truth plainly enough in the space between the forms, in the way Alina's eyes followed Seraphina across a room, in the way Seraphina found any excuse at all to be near her. The whispers began, as whispers always do, among the servants first. A maid who had seen the two of them walking hand in hand along the far edge of the orchard, certain they were unobserved. A footman who had heard laughter of a particular warmth drifting from the sitting room long after the lesson hour should have ended. Mrs. Doyle, who had guessed the truth of it weeks before anyone else and had said nothing, found herself now fielding careful, probing questions from the younger staff, questions she deflected as best she could, though she knew, with the weary certainty of long experience, that a secret held by an entire household staff was no secret at all, only a truth waiting for the right ear to reach it. It reached the Duke in the end, through the very last person Seraphina would have chosen, had she been given any say in the matter. Lord Sedgwick Bramwell was a neighboring landowner of considerable fortune and considerably more ambition, a man some 10 years Seraphina's senior who had made his interest in her known to the Duke on more than one occasion over the past 2 years, an interest the Duke had neither encouraged nor firmly discouraged, waiting, as fathers of his rank so often did, to see whether a more advantageous match might present itself before committing his daughter to the first respectable offer. Lord Bramwell had called at Ashworth Hall on a warm afternoon in late July, ostensibly to discuss a matter of shared boundary with the Duke's steward, and had arrived early enough to find himself walking, unannounced, through the rose garden, where he came upon Seraphina and Alina seated together beneath the old oak near the fountain, their heads bent close over a single book, Alina's hand resting, entirely without thought, upon Seraphina's where it lay on the open page. They separated the moment they heard his step on the gravel, but not quickly enough, and Lord Bramwell, a man who prided himself on missing very little, said nothing at all in the moment, merely bowed with exaggerated courtesy and continued on toward the house as though he had seen nothing worth remarking upon. But Seraphina saw the look in his eyes as he passed, a look of calculation rather than surprise, and she understood with a cold drop in her stomach that whatever he had witnessed would not stay buried in his silence for long. She was right to fear it. Lord Bramwell, finding his own suit towards Seraphina going nowhere and his pride wounded by the Duke's evident lack of urgency in accepting his offer, saw in what he had witnessed a use far more valuable to him than simple gossip. He raised the matter with the Duke directly, that very afternoon, framing it not as an accusation, but as a concern, the concern of a family friend for the reputation of a house he hoped still to be joined to by marriage. "I would not wish to speak out of turn, Your Grace," he said, seated across from the Duke in the same study where, months before, Seraphina had first heard her own future being discussed without her. "But I confess I was troubled by what I witnessed in your garden this afternoon. Your daughter and her governess, seated rather closer than instruction requires, and I could not help but notice a certain familiarity between them that I thought, as a friend of this family, you would wish to be made aware of." The Duke listened, his expression giving away little, though something cold and unfamiliar had begun to settle in his chest at Lord Bramwell's careful, deliberate phrasing. He had noticed, of course, in his own distracted way, that his daughter had grown attached to her governess, had been grateful for it, had credited Miss Hartley with the transformation he had witnessed in Seraphina over the past year, the laughter returning to the house, the long silences broken, the girl who had once locked herself away with her grief now bright-eyed and eager at every meal. He had not allowed himself to examine that attachment too closely, had not wanted to, and Lord Bramwell's words now forced upon him a question he had been quietly avoiding for months. "I am certain there is nothing improper in a warm friendship between a pupil and her teacher," the Duke said, though even to his own ears the words sounded less certain than he intended them to be. "Of course, Your Grace," Lord Bramwell said, in a tone that suggested he believed no such thing at all. "I only mention it out of concern for the family's good name, should such familiarity be observed by less discreet company than myself. It would be a pity, would it not, for any shadow to fall over Lady Seraphina's prospects, particularly when those prospects are, I hope, still very much open to discussion between us." He left soon after, having planted his seed with the precision of a man who understood exactly how much damage a careful word could do, and the Duke sat alone in his study long into the evening, the fire burning low, turning over months of small observations he had allowed himself to overlook because the alternative, the truth Lord Bramwell had all but named outright, was more than he knew how to face. He said nothing that evening, watching his daughter and Alina across the supper table with new and unwelcome attention, noting for the first time, or perhaps simply allowing himself to notice for the first time, the particular ease between them, the way Seraphina's whole manner softened whenever Alina spoke, the way Alina, for her part, seemed to watch Seraphina with a care that went well beyond the professional interest of a governess in her charge's progress. He said nothing the following day either, though he found reasons to pass by the sitting room during their lesson hours more often than he had before, and found reasons, too, to ask Mrs. Doyle careful, roundabout questions about the household's general contentment, questions the old housekeeper answered with a caution that told him, more clearly than any direct statement could have, that she at least suspected more than she was willing to say. Seraphina, unaware of the precise shape of the danger gathering around her, felt only a growing unease in her father's manner, a watchfulness that had not been there before, and she began, cautiously, to wonder whether the freedom she and Alina had allowed themselves through the long golden weeks of summer had been noticed after all. "Your father looked at us strangely at supper," she said to Alina one evening, the two of them walking the garden paths in the blue hour just before full dark, when the roses gave off their heaviest scent and the first stars had begun to show above the tree line. As though he were trying to solve a puzzle he did not wish to have in front of him. "I noticed it too," Alina admitted, and there was a new tightness in her voice, the old caution returning after weeks of relative ease. "Perhaps we have grown careless, Seraphina. Lord Bramwell's visit last week. I did not like the way he looked at us in the garden. He is a small, vain man who cannot bear that I will not have him," Seraphina said, though even as she spoke the words she felt a cold thread of fear winding through her chest, because she remembered, now that Alina mentioned it, the particular quality of his gaze as he had passed them beneath the oak tree, and she understood, too late, exactly what kind of weapon a scorned suitor might make of what he had seen. "Small, vain men are often the most dangerous kind," Alina said quietly, "because they have nothing to lose by causing harm, and everything to gain if it wounds the person who refused them." They walked the rest of the path in silence, the ease of the summer evening gone, replaced by a watchfulness neither of them had felt in weeks. And when they parted at the top of the stairs, Alina's hand found Serafina's for just a moment. A brief and fierce pressure of fingers that said everything neither of them dared to say aloud in a house that had, it seemed, begun listening rather more closely than either of them had realized. That night, unable to sleep, Serafina rose and made her way quietly down toward the library, thinking she might find some comfort in the familiar shelves and the smell of old paper that had always steadied her since childhood. She had not gone halfway down the darkened corridor when she heard voices, low and urgent, coming from the study, her father's voice and another she did not immediately recognize, and she stopped in the shadows beyond the doorway, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. "I will not have it said that my house harbors improper conduct," her father was saying, his voice tight with a strain she rarely heard in him. "But nor will I dismiss a woman on the word of a man who has every reason to see wickedness where there is none, simply because his pride has been wounded." "I only ask that you look carefully, Your Grace," came Lord Bramwell's voice, smooth and unhurried, and Serafina felt her whole body go cold at the sound of it, at the realization that he had returned, uninvited and unannounced, to press his advantage further. "For your daughter's sake, if not for mine. Whatever affection exists between Lady Serafina and Miss Hartley, it cannot be permitted to continue unchecked. Consider what it would mean for her future, for any marriage you might hope to arrange for her, should word of it ever spread beyond this house." Serafina stood frozen in the darkened corridor, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall, and understood, with a clarity that felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet, that the quiet, private truth she and Alina had built together through a long and golden summer was no longer entirely their own to protect. It had been seen and named, however carefully, and now it sat in her father's study like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out toward a shore neither she nor Alina could yet see. She did not go into the library that night. She returned instead to her own room, and sat by the window until the sky began to gray with the first light of dawn, thinking that whatever quiet, careful courage she and Alina had been gathering toward some distant, unspecified future, they no longer had the luxury of time in which to gather it slowly. The choice that had always been waiting for them, somewhere ahead in the vague and comfortable distance, had arrived now, sudden and immediate, and there would be no more soft evenings in the rose garden in which to avoid it. The Duke summoned Alina to his study the following morning, before breakfast, before Serafina had even risen from an uneasy, dreamless sleep, and Alina went to him with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, having lain awake half the night herself turning over every possible shape the coming conversation might take. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, once she had closed the door behind her and stood before his desk in the pale morning light, "I have always found you to be an honest woman. I ask you now to prove that impression correct. Is there truth to a certain concern that has been raised regarding your conduct with my daughter?" Alina had known this question was coming, had rehearsed a dozen careful answers through the long sleepless hours, evasions and half-truths that might protect them both a little longer, buy time enough to find some better path forward than the one now closing in around them. But standing there in the gray light, facing a man who had trusted her with the care of his only child, and had never once, in all their months together, treated her as anything less than a person deserving of respect, she found that she could not bring herself to lie to him outright. "I do not know precisely what has been reported to you, Your Grace," she said carefully, "and so I cannot say whether it is true or false without knowing its shape. But I will not insult you by pretending I do not understand the nature of your question." "Then answer it plainly," the Duke said, and there was something raw beneath the formal control of his voice, the sound of a man who had already guessed the answer and was asking only to hear it confirmed or denied by someone he had trusted to be truthful with him. "Do you have feelings for my daughter beyond what is proper between a governess and her charge?" The silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the tall clock in the corner and the distant sound of the household beginning to stir for the day, and Alina understood that whatever she said next would decide, in one direction or another, the whole shape of what came after. Yes, she said finally, quietly, I do. The Duke closed his eyes for a moment, as though the confirmation, expected as it was, still landed as a blow. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened into something Alina had never seen there before. The cold, formal mask of a man retreating into the authority of his title, because the alternative, facing this as simply a father and a friend, was more than he knew how to bear. Then you understand that your position in this house is no longer tenable, he said. I will provide you with fair wages through the end of the month, and a character reference that reflects your genuine skill as a teacher, whatever else has passed between us. But you cannot remain under this roof, Miss Hartley. Surely you see that. I do see it, Alina said, and her voice, though she fought to keep it steady, betrayed her at last, cracking on the final word. I have known it since the moment I first understood my own feelings, Your Grace. I have tried, more than you know, to leave before matters came to precisely this point. It was Lady Seraphina who asked me to stay. Something flickered across the Duke's face at this, some complicated mixture of anger and grief and a reluctant, unwelcome understanding. And for a moment he looked less like a Duke passing judgment, and more like a tired man who had lost, in quick succession, both the wife he had loved and now, it seemed, the easy relationship he had believed he still held with his only daughter. You will leave within the week, he said finally, his voice regaining its formal coldness. I will explain to my daughter that your services are no longer required, that other arrangements have been made for her continued education. I would ask that you not seek to say goodbye to her in private. It will only make matters more difficult for everyone. Alina left the study with her chin high and her hands shaking at her sides, and she did not weep until she had reached the privacy of her own small room, where she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Hall nearly a year before, to fully feel the weight of everything she stood to lose. Seraphina learned of her father's decision not from the Duke himself, who could not quite bring himself to face his daughter with the news directly, but from Mrs. Doyle, who came to her chamber with a face so carefully composed that Seraphina understood, before a single word had been spoken, that something terrible had happened. Miss Hartley is to leave within the week, my lady, Mrs. Doyle said gently, and Seraphina felt the words strike her like a physical blow, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet. Your father has spoken to her already. I am sorry. I did not think it would come to this so quickly. Seraphina did not wait to hear anything further. She found her father in his study still, the morning's difficult conversation still visible in the tightness of his shoulders, and the untouched breakfast tray on the corner of his desk. And she came into the room without knocking, without any of the careful courtesies that usually governed their exchanges. You would send her away without a word to me, she said, and her voice shook with an anger that had been building since the moment Mrs. Doyle had spoken. After everything she has done for this family, after everything she has done for me. Seraphina, the Duke said heavily, sit down, please. I will not sit down. I will not be managed like a child who has misbehaved and must be sent to her room until she calms herself. Seraphina stood before his desk, her hands trembling, tears standing in her eyes that she refused to let fall. You know what she is to me, don't you? That is why you are sending her away. Not because of some rumor from a jealous, spiteful man, but because you know it is true and you cannot bear to face it. The Duke was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier coldness, replaced by something closer to exhaustion, the sound of a man who had spent the whole night wrestling with a question he had never expected to face. I do not know what to do with what I have learned, Seraphina, he said. I was not raised to understand it, and I confess I do not fully understand it even now. What I do know is that the world we live in will not be kind to you, to either of you, if this becomes known beyond the walls of this house. I am trying to protect you. You are trying to protect yourself, Seraphina said, though even as she spoke the words she saw, with sudden painful clarity, that this was not entirely fair, that her father's fear, however clumsily expressed, came from something that at least resembled love, twisted and frightened as it was by everything he had been taught his whole life about duty and respectability, and the proper shape a daughter's future was meant to take. You are afraid of what people will say, and so you would rather cause me pain yourself than risk anyone else causing it first. The Duke flinched at this, and for a moment father and daughter simply looked at one another across the width of the desk. Two people who loved each other and did not know, in that raw and difficult moment, how to reach across the distance that had opened suddenly and violently between them. "I have not decided anything is final," the Duke said at last, though his voice carried little conviction. "I have only asked Miss Hartley to leave the house. I have not decided what becomes of you or of your future beyond that." "Then decide nothing yet," Serafina said. "Give me time, give us time. I'm not asking you to announce anything to the county, father. I am only asking you not to tear away, in a single morning, the one good thing that has happened in this house since mother died." It was the mention of her mother that seemed to land hardest, and the Duke's composed mask cracked at last, something raw and grieving showing through it. And for a moment Serafina thought he might relent entirely, might call the whole matter closed and let things return to whatever fragile, careful shape they had held through the long summer weeks. But then his expression closed again, retreating behind the familiar armor of duty, and he shook his head slowly. "I need time to think, Serafina," he said. "That is all I can offer you today. Do not press me further." She left the study without another word, her anger and her grief tangled together so tightly she could barely tell where one ended and the other began, and she went in search of Alina, finding her at last in her own small room, a half-packed trunk open on the floor, Alina sitting very still beside it with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression of quiet, controlled devastation on her face. "He has asked me not to see you privately," Alina said before Serafina could speak. "I am breaking that request already, simply by allowing you through this door. Serafina, please. Do not make this harder than it already is." "I will not let you simply disappear," Serafina said, crossing the small room and kneeling beside the trunk, taking both of Alina's hands in her own despite every instinct telling her that this, precisely this, was what had brought them to this precipice in the first place. "Not after everything, not without a fight." "There is no fight to be had, my love," Alina said, and the endearment, spoken plainly for the first time between them, seemed to undo something in both of them at once, tears finally spilling down Alina's face as she said it. "Your father is a duke. I am a governess with no family fortune and no title to protect me. There is no version of this story where I simply refuse to leave, and the world allows it." "Then I will make him listen," Serafina said, with a fierce, sudden certainty that surprised even herself, a resolve forming out of the wreckage of the morning's confrontation like something solid rising out of storm-tossed water. "Not with anger, not with accusations. I will go to him properly, and I will ask him plainly for what I want, the way I should have done from the very beginning instead of letting this be discovered by a man like Lord Bramwell in the worst possible way." "Serafina," Alina said softly, cupping her face in both hands, "what is it you mean to ask him?" Serafina looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had taught her, over the course of a single transforming year, that she was not a problem to be solved, that her thoughts and her feelings were worth taking seriously, that love did not have to be a quiet, careful thing kept hidden in the margins of a life otherwise dictated by others. She thought of every reason the world would offer her for staying silent, for letting Alina go quietly and finding, in time, some more suitable arrangement that would satisfy her father and Lord Bramwell, and everyone else who believed they knew better than she did what shape her happiness ought to take. "I mean to ask him for permission to marry you," she said, and saying it aloud, plainly in the small room with the half-packed trunk between them, felt like stepping off the edge of that cliff she had been standing at for months, uncertain whether anything at all waited to catch her below. Alina tried for the better part of an hour to talk her out of it, arguing every practical objection she could summon, that such a request had no precedent, that the Duke could not simply grant it even if he wished to, that the law itself offered no path toward the kind of life Serafina was imagining for them, no church that would bless it, no document that could make it official in the eyes of the world beyond these walls. Serafina listened to all of it, and did not waver. I know all of that, she said finally, taking Aliner's hands again, more gently this time. I know we cannot simply walk into a church and be married the way a man and a woman would. But there is more than one kind of marriage, Aliner, and more than one kind of permission I might ask my father for. I want him to know, plainly, without the careful evasions we have been living inside for months, that I intend to build my life around you, in whatever form that is allowed to take. I want his blessing, not because the law requires it, but because he is my father, and because I do not wish to spend the rest of my life as a stranger to him, hiding the truest part of myself behind polite silences at supper. And if he refuses, Aliner asked quietly, if he casts you off entirely, disowns you, sends you from this house the way he is sending me, then I will have my answer, Serafina said, and I will have you, and we will build something together outside these walls, however difficult that proves to be. I would rather have that, Aliner, than a comfortable life here built on a lie I tell every single day for the rest of my life. She did not go to her father that same evening, understanding that a request of such weight deserved more care than the raw, wounded hours immediately following their earlier confrontation could offer. She waited instead through 2 long, difficult days, days in which Aliner's packing continued in slow, reluctant stages, in which the household staff moved through the halls with the particular hushed carefulness of servants who sensed a great deal more than they had been told, in which the Duke kept largely to his study, emerging only for meals eaten in a silence far heavier than any that had passed between them before. On the 3rd morning, Serafina rose early, dressed with more care than usual, and made her way down to the study before the household had properly woken, knowing that whatever courage she had gathered through 2 sleepless nights might not survive contact with the ordinary business of a normal day. She found her father already awake, seated at his desk with a cup of tea gone cold beside him, staring at nothing in particular, and she understood from the deep shadows beneath his eyes that he had slept no better than she had. "Father," she said, closing the door quietly behind her, "I have come to ask you something, and I would ask that you hear the whole of it before you answer." The Duke looked up, something wary and tired in his expression, and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit, then," he said. "I find I have little strength left for standing arguments this morning." Serafina sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling, and began, haltingly at first and then with growing steadiness, to say everything she had rehearsed through the long sleepless nights, and everything, too, that she had not rehearsed at all, that simply rose up out of her in the telling. "I have known Aliner Hartley for less than a year," she said, "and in that year she has given me more than any tutor or governess before her ever managed in a decade. She taught me to think rather than simply memorize. She taught me that my thoughts were worth having in the first place, after years of feeling like a problem this house was quietly trying to solve. And somewhere in the midst of all that teaching, Father, I fell in love with her. Not carelessly, not as some passing fancy of a lonely girl grateful for attention, but truly, completely, in a way I do not believe I will ever feel for anyone else as long as I live." The Duke opened his mouth as though to speak, and Serafina raised a hand gently, asking for his patience a moment longer. "I know what you will say," she went on, "that it is impossible, that the law does not permit it, that the church will not bless it, that society will never accept it, that you have a title and a family name to consider, and a daughter whose future marriage was meant to secure this estate's alliances for a generation to come. I have thought of every one of those objections myself, over and over, through nights when I could not sleep for thinking of them. I do not have an answer to all of them. I cannot promise you that the world will be kind to us, or that some door will open that allows Aliner and me the same simple, recognized marriage that any ordinary man and woman might have. What I can promise you is that I intend to spend my life with her regardless, in whatever form that life is allowed to take, whether inside this house or far away from it." She paused, gathering the last and most difficult part of what she had come to say, and found, when she spoke again, that her voice had steadied into something quieter and more certain than she had expected. I am not asking you to change the law, Father, or to fight the whole of society on our behalf. I am asking for something much smaller and much larger than that. I am asking for your blessing. I am asking you to treat this the way you would treat any request from a daughter who had fallen in love and wished to build a life with the person she loved, rather than as a scandal to be managed and buried before it can spread. I am asking you to let Alina stay, not as my governess, for that arrangement was never going to last regardless of what has passed between us, but as something else, whatever we might call it, a companion, a household member, a woman I have chosen to share my life with in every way that is available to us. I am asking you to be my father in this, and not only the Duke of Ashworth. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Seraphina began to fear she had misjudged everything, had asked for something so far beyond what her father could grant that he would simply sit there in silence until she understood without a single word spoken that the answer was no. But when the Duke finally spoke, his voice was not cold nor angry, but rough with an emotion he seemed to be fighting to control. Your mother, he said slowly, used to say that I loved this house and this title more than I loved the people inside it. I told her she was wrong every time she said it, and I believed myself when I said so. But I have spent the last 3 days thinking of little else but that accusation, Seraphina, turning it over and over, wondering whether I am about to prove her right, all these years after she is gone. Father, Seraphina began, but he raised his own hand now, asking the same patience of her that she had asked of him. I do not understand what you feel for Miss Hartley, he said. I will not pretend to you that I do, or that I find it easy to accept, because I do not yet, perhaps not for a long while. I was raised, as you were, to believe certain things were simply the shape the world took, immovable beyond question. It is no small thing you are asking me to set aside. He paused, and something in his face softened, some of the exhaustion giving way to a kind of raw and difficult tenderness Seraphina had not seen there in years. But I watched you these past months, Seraphina, more closely than perhaps either of us realized. I watched a daughter I had feared I was losing to grief and silence come back to life before my eyes. I told myself it was good teaching. I did not want to look closer than that, because I think, somewhere beneath my own careful denials, I already suspected what I would find if I did. Seraphina held her breath, watching her father's face, hardly daring to hope that the conversation was bending toward something other than the refusal she had steeled herself to expect. I cannot give you a wedding, Seraphina, the Duke said finally. I cannot stand before the county and announce what you are asking me to announce. The world is not ready for that, and I fear it will not be ready for a very long time yet, long after both of us are gone from it. But I find, when I search my own heart honestly, that I am more afraid of losing you than I am of what the neighbors might whisper behind their fans at the next assembly. I have already lost your mother. I do not intend to lose you as well, not over something I have the power, however imperfectly, to prevent. Then you will let her stay, Seraphina said, hardly able to believe the words as she said them, hope rising in her chest so sharply it was almost painful. I will let her stay, the Duke said slowly, on terms we will need to think through carefully for both your protection and hers. Lord Bramwell will not be silent about what he witnessed, of that I am certain, and there will be difficulties ahead that neither of us can yet fully see. But I will not send Alina Hartley from this house, and I will not stand in the way of whatever life you mean to build with her, so long as you understand that it will not be an easy one, and that I cannot promise you the world will ever fully accept it. Seraphina rose from her chair and came around the desk, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, embraced her father without reservation, without the careful, guarded distance that had characterized so much of their life together since her mother's death, and felt him, after a moment's hesitation, embrace her back just as fully. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you, father." "Do not thank me yet," the Duke said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer troubled to hide. "We have a great deal still to face, you and I, and Miss Hartley besides. Lord Bramwell will not simply let this matter rest, not after the wound to his pride, and there may be others like him who will not be so easily managed. But you have my blessing, such as it is, and my help in facing whatever comes next. That much at least I can promise you with a whole heart." Serafina left the study that morning lighter than she had felt in months, hurrying through the halls to find Alina, to tell her that the trunk half-packed on her floor could be unpacked again, that whatever difficult road lay ahead of them, they would walk it together, inside these walls rather than scattered apart by fear and convention. She did not yet know the full shape of the challenges Lord Bramwell and the wider world would still bring to their door. But for the first time since the whole delicate, frightening truth of her feelings had come spilling out in a rain-soaked barn months before, she felt something like solid ground beneath her feet. The unpacking of Alina's trunk was, as it turned out, the easiest part of what followed. Word travels quickly in a county where every great house watches its neighbors as closely as it watches itself, and it was not a fortnight before Lord Bramwell, stung by the Duke's continued refusal to entertain his marriage suit, and now armed with a piece of knowledge he considered a weapon rather than a secret, began to let certain careful remarks slip at the card tables and dinner parties of the surrounding gentry, remarks dressed up as concern, as the sort of thing a good friend of the family felt obligated, regretfully, to mention. The Duke heard of it within days, carried to him by a steward who had it from a groom who had it from a maid in Lord Bramwell's own household, the way such things always traveled, sideways and downward through the halls of great houses, until they found their way back up again to the ears they were meant to wound. He called Serafina and Alina together into his study that same evening, his face grim in the candlelight. "Bramwell means to make this public," he said without preamble. "Not directly, not in a manner that could be traced back to him with any certainty, but through enough careful whispers that within a month it will be the talk of every drawing-room from here to the county seat. He means to force my hand, I think, believing that if the scandal grows large enough, I will be forced to send Miss Hartley away simply to salvage what remains of this family's reputation, and that I will then be more inclined to accept his suit for you after all, as the safest remaining path back toward respectability." Serafina felt a cold, sharp fear rise in her chest, not for herself but for Alina, who sat very still beside her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You will not send her away," she said, though it came out more as a plea than the confident statement she had intended. "I have already told you I will not," the Duke said, "and I do not intend to break that promise for fear of a spiteful man's gossip. But I would be lying to you both if I pretended this changes nothing. Whatever protection I can offer within these walls, I cannot control what is said in every drawing-room in the county, and I cannot promise you that society's judgment, once it falls, will be easily reversed." Alina spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice steady despite the fear Serafina could see plainly in her eyes. "Then, perhaps, Your Grace, the wisest course is not to wait for Lord Bramwell to shape the story to his own advantage, but to shape it ourselves before he has the chance." Both the Duke and Serafina turned to look at her, and Alina continued, choosing her words with obvious care. "Lord Bramwell's power in this lies entirely in the idea that he has uncovered something shameful, something hidden that we are desperate to keep buried. If there is nothing left to uncover, if the household simply carries on, unashamed and unafraid, his whispers lose most of their sting. Let it be known, carefully, through whatever channels you think wisest, that I remain in this house as a companion to Lady Serafina, valued and respected, and that whatever Lord Bramwell believes he witnessed in a garden was nothing more than the ordinary affection between two women who have grown close over a year of shared lessons. Let him make his accusations plainly, if he dares, and let him find that this family does not flinch or scatter at the sound of them." The Duke considered this for a long moment, turning the strategy over with the same careful attention he might have given to a difficult matter of estate business, and Serafina watched something in his posture settle, the decision forming behind his eyes. "It is a bold approach," he said finally, "and not without risk. But I confess I find I have grown tired of managing my family's life around the comfort of men like Bramwell. Very well, we will not hide. We will not confirm what he suspects outright, for there is no need to hand him proof of a private matter that is, in the end, no one's business but our own. but nor will we behave as though we have something to be ashamed of. It was not, in the end, a single dramatic confrontation that settled the matter, but a slow, steady campaign of ordinary courage. Played out over the following weeks at every dinner and assembly, the Duke could not avoid without drawing further suspicion. He brought Alina with him, introduced as his daughter's valued companion, to a small gathering at the home of a neighboring baronet, and watched with grim satisfaction as she conducted herself with such easy grace and evident intelligence, that even the most skeptical of the assembled guests found themselves charmed despite their careful predisposition to disapprove. He spoke of Miss Hartley, when the subject arose, as one might speak of any trusted member of the household, with plain and unremarkable regard, offering Lord Bramwell's whispered insinuations nothing to fasten themselves onto beyond the thin air from which they had first been spun. Lord Bramwell, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated as the scandal he had hoped to ignite failed to catch, smothered as it was by the Duke's calm refusal to react, and by Alina's own quiet, dignified presence at every gathering where his whispers might otherwise have found fertile ground. He made one final attempt, at a large assembly held at the county seat in early autumn, to force the matter into the open, approaching Seraphina directly on the dance floor and speaking in a voice pitched deliberately to carry. "I wonder, Lady Seraphina," he said, as they moved through the careful steps of a country dance, "whether your father has fully considered the wisdom of keeping a governess in his household so long past the point where her instruction could reasonably be considered necessary. One begins to wonder what other purpose she might serve, beyond lessons in French and drawing." Seraphina felt her whole body go rigid with anger, but she had spent weeks now preparing herself for precisely this moment, and she found, when she answered him, that her voice came out steady and cool, carrying just as clearly as his own had done to the ears of the surrounding company. "Miss Hartley remains in my father's household because she is valued, Lord Bramwell, both for her excellent instruction and for the friendship my father and I have both come to hold for her," she said. "I confess I find it curious that a man of your standing troubles himself so persistently with the private arrangements of another family's household. One might almost think you had nothing better to occupy your considerable leisure." A ripple of amusement passed through the nearby dancers who had caught the exchange, and Lord Bramwell, finding himself for once the object of quiet laughter rather than the source of scandalous revelation, colored deeply and said nothing further for the remainder of the dance. He left the assembly early that evening, and though he did not entirely abandon his campaign of whispers in the weeks that followed, they carried less and less weight with each passing month, worn thin by the family's steady refusal to be shamed by them, and by the simple, undeniable fact that Ashworth Hall continued to run as it always had, its household content, its Duke unshaken, its daughter, if anything, more radiant and more sure of herself than the county had ever seen her. By the time winter closed in again over the estate, a full year after Alina's carriage had first arrived on that gray, uncertain morning, the shape of their lives had settled into something Seraphina had once believed entirely impossible. Alina remained at Ashworth Hall, her role quietly transformed from governess to companion to something closer still, that had no easy word attached to it in the language of the world around them, but that both of them understood plainly enough between themselves. They took their meals together with the Duke each evening, walked the gardens each afternoon regardless of who might be watching, and Seraphina no longer felt the need to save up small thoughts through the quiet hours of the day to share later, because there were no longer any hours in which Alina's presence was not, in some way, close at hand. The Duke, for his part, found that the fear he had carried into that difficult conversation months before had not, in the end, cost him nearly as much as he had feared, and had instead given him back a daughter more fully present in her own life than he had seen her since before her mother's death. He watched them together at the fireside on long winter evenings, Alina reading aloud from some volume of poetry, Seraphina laughing at some observation only the two of them fully understood, and found that whatever discomfort still lingered in him at the strangeness of it all had been steadily, quietly outweighed by the simple, undeniable happiness written plainly across his daughter's face. He did not pretend, even to himself, that the road ahead would remain smooth. There would be other Lord Bramwells, other whispered scandals, other difficult conversations still to come as the years unfolded, and neither he nor his daughter nor Alina could promise one another that the wider world would ever fully soften toward an arrangement it had not been built to recognize or accept. But he had learned, through the difficult months of that single transforming year, that his daughter's happiness was worth more to him than the easy comfort of a world that asked nothing of him but silent conformity. And he found, turning the matter over one final time in the quiet of his own study, that he did not regret the choice he had made. Serafina, for her part, thought often in those winter evenings of the frightened, guarded girl who had stood in the study a year before, listening to her own future being decided without her, certain that another governess would come and go like all the ones before her, certain that she was destined to remain closed off and alone in a house too large and too silent for a single grieving family to fill. She thought of how close she had come to letting fear win, in that rain-soaked barn, in the careful distance she and Alina had tried and failed to maintain through a long, anxious summer. And she was grateful, more grateful than she could easily put into words, that in the end she had chosen honesty over safety, courage over the comfortable, familiar shape of silence. She had asked her father for something the world had no proper name for, no church to bless it and no law to protect it, and he had given her instead something perhaps even more valuable than a wedding day: his understanding, however imperfect, and his refusal to let convention take from her the one thing that had finally made her whole. It was not the ending she might once have imagined for herself, in the vague, half-formed daydreams of a lonely childhood spent wandering empty gardens. It was, she thought, watching Alina's face in the firelight, something better because it was real and hard-won and entirely her own. Spring returned once more to Ashworth Hall, the second spring since Alina's arrival, and with it came a letter that none of them had expected, addressed to the Duke in a hand he did not immediately recognize, bearing the seal of a family several counties distant. It was from a widowed cousin of the Duke's late wife, a woman named Charlotte Winslow, who wrote to say she had heard, through the slow and winding channels by which such news traveled, something of the unusual harmony that had settled over Ashworth Hall, and wished, if the Duke would permit it, to call upon the family that summer with her own daughter, a young woman named Louisa who had, in Charlotte's careful and deliberately vague phrasing, struggled to find contentment within the ordinary expectations placed upon women of her station. The Duke read the letter twice before showing it to Serafina, uncertain what to make of its careful, guarded language, but Serafina understood at once, with a flash of recognition that startled her, exactly what her distant cousin was asking, without quite daring to ask it outright. She thought of all the years she herself had spent believing there was something wrong with her, something unreachable and closed off, before Alina had arrived and taught her otherwise, and she felt a fierce, protective sympathy for a cousin she had never met, a young woman perhaps standing exactly where she herself had once stood, uncertain and afraid and entirely alone in a feeling she had no name for. "We must have them here," Serafina said, and the Duke, watching his daughter's face, did not need to ask her reasons twice. Charlotte and Louisa arrived in early June, and Serafina watched, over the following weeks, as her young cousin, initially guarded and quiet in the particular way of someone who had learned caution the hard way, slowly began to unfold in the presence of a household that did not flinch or whisper or treat difference as scandal. Louisa spent long hours with Alina in the library, discussing books with the same hungry, grateful curiosity Serafina herself had once brought to those same lessons, and Serafina began to understand that whatever she and Alina had built together at Ashworth Hall was not simply a private happiness sealed away behind the estate's walls, but something that might, in its own quiet way, offer shelter and possibility to others who needed it. Family who arrived carrying the same fears Serafina had once carried herself. It was not, of course, a solution to every difficulty. Lord Bramwell continued, in his diminished and increasingly ignored fashion, to speak ill of the household whenever he found an audience willing to listen, though fewer and fewer such audiences remained willing as the years passed, and Ashworth Hall continued, visibly and stubbornly, to thrive. There were other neighbors, other distant relations, who never fully accepted the shape of the household Seraphina and Alina had built together, who offered cool nods rather than warm invitations, who spoke of the family, when they spoke of it at all, in careful, clipped tones that made their disapproval plain without ever stating it outright. Seraphina learned, in time, to hold that disapproval more lightly than she might once have imagined possible, understanding that she could not control the opinions of a world built on rules she had chosen not to follow, and that the opinions of those who mattered most to her, her father, Alina, the small circle of family and friends who had chosen understanding over judgment, mattered a great deal more than the whispers of strangers at a distant assembly. The Duke, watching his household grow rather than shrink in the years that followed, watching his daughter's happiness prove steady rather than fleeting, found that his own understanding deepened alongside hers, the discomfort of that first difficult conversation softening year by year into something closer to simple, unremarkable acceptance. He grew old in that house, surrounded by more warmth than he had known since his wife's death, Alina's steady presence a source of comfort to him in his own right by the time his hair had gone fully gray. And when he thought, in the quiet of his final years, of the choice he had made in that study on a difficult autumn morning, he thought of it not as the sacrifice of duty to sentiment that Lord Bramwell and men like him had always insisted it must be, but as the truest exercise of duty he had ever managed, the duty of a father to see his child fully, and to choose her happiness over the comfortable, empty shape of a reputation built on silence. Seraphina herself, looking back in later years at the frightened, guarded girl who had once stood outside her father's study door listening to her own future being decided without her, found it strange to remember how close she had come to accepting that future without a fight, to letting herself be sent quietly north to a distant relative rather than risk the far more frightening prospect of asking, plainly and honestly, for what she truly wanted. She had learned in the year that changed everything that courage was rarely a single dramatic act, a single moment of standing before a father and speaking difficult truths, but was instead 1,000 smaller choices made one after another. The choice to walk beside someone without fear of who might be watching. The choice to speak honestly in a rain-soaked barn, even when honesty seemed likely to cost her everything. The choice, again and again, to believe that she deserved a life shaped by her own true feelings, rather than by the comfortable, familiar expectations of everyone around her. Alina, for her part, never fully lost the careful watchfulness that had marked her first months at Ashworth Hall, the instinct, born of years spent as a woman with no fortune and no protection beyond her own good sense, to notice which rooms were safe and which were not, which company could be trusted and which could not. But she found, as the years passed, that the watchfulness softened into something less like fear and more like simple wisdom, the hard-won knowledge of a woman who had once nearly walked away from the truest happiness she would ever know, out of a caution that, however understandable, had very nearly cost her everything. She thought often of that first afternoon in the doorway, the frightened, guarded girl who had tried to send her away before even seeing her face, and she found, looking at the woman Seraphina had become in the years since, a warm and quiet pride that had nothing to do with teaching and everything to do with love. They grew old together at Ashworth Hall, in a household that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to make room for a happiness the wider world had never quite been built to recognize. And when young Louisa returned years later, herself grown and settled and no longer frightened, with a companion of her own she introduced with the same careful, hopeful courage Seraphina had once summoned in her father's study. Seraphina understood that whatever she and Alina had built together in that first transforming year had outlasted them both, becoming something larger than either of them. A small, stubborn light kept burning in a house that had once seemed, to a lonely girl standing at an upstairs window, like the loneliest place in the whole wide world.